When we read Hebrews chapter 12, there are two verses there that often gets misunderstood. One says, "Follow peace with all men, without which no man shall see the Lord." That's in verse 14. Later in that same chapter, it says, "For our God is a consuming fire," towards the ending. That is in verse 29. Now, some people take that last phrase, "our God is a consuming fire," to mean that God devours or destroys people with fire. But that is not what the writer was trying to say. Let's look at the context. The whole chapter of Hebrews 12 is about conduct and correction. The writer reminds us that those whom God loves, He disciplines, He corrects. Correction isn't a sign of rejection, it's a proof that we are His children. So the focus here is on how God shapes our character to reflect His nature. When verse 14 says, "Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord," it's not saying that if you don't behave perfectly, you will miss heaven. It means that when we live in peace and walk in holiness, people around us can see the Lord in us. Our lives becomes a reflection of God's transforming work, a visible testimony of His grace that is at work in us. Then when we get to verse 29, "For our God is a consuming fire," the writer is summing up everything. The phrase "consuming fire" comes from Deuteronomy 4:24. In the Greek, that word means consume and is pronounced katalanisko, which means to use up or bring to completion. The idea of that word comes from doing something to the end, to do something to the end. So it's not describing a God who destroys, but a God who perfects. Everything God begins, He finishes completely. When He makes you righteous, He doesn't make you halfway righteous. He completes it. His fire represents His purifying and perfecting nature. God's salvation is to the uttermost, according to Hebrews 7:25. And also, Paul says in Romans 8, God's work in us is moving towards total transformation, that is, in our spirit, in our soul, and in our body, until mortality is swallowed up with immortality. So when Hebrews says, "For our God is a consuming fire," it's declaring that God's work in us is thorough. He refines, purifies, and does it completely. When we follow peace with all men, we are giving expression to the inward transformation and letting others see the work of Christ alive in us. This is what this verse means. It's trying to talk about how believers should conduct themselves and how they should live out the righteousness that they've received in our conduct amongst believers. If you read verse 13, the next chapter, it talks about "let brotherly love continues." So it's talking about how believers should conduct themselves among themselves and in the world. This is what this verse means.